sunken Soviet nuclear submarine that's been on the seafloor for 3 decades is leaking an abnormally high amount of radiation now.
Most people believe nuclear submarines become harmless once they sink. They believe that the deep ocean locks them in place, cuts them off from the world, and freezes the danger in time. But that belief turned out to be very wrong after scientists lowered a remote-controlled vehicle to the wreck of the Soviet submarine K-278.
Barely torn apart. Look at that.
What appeared on their monitors shocked them to the bone. When the surrounding water was tested, radiation levels were found to be 1,000,000 times higher than normal.
And that energy release was probably equivalent to many tons of TNT, energy that just is almost impossible to imagine.
That single leak shattered decades of assumptions because K-278 isn't alone, and whatever is happening down there is a ticking nuclear disaster, waiting to explode. The leak that shouldn't exist. In 2019, a remotely operated vehicle descended through the black water of the Norwegian Sea toward a wreck the world had been told was no longer a problem. The Soviet nuclear submarine K-278 Komsomolets had been sitting on the ocean floor since 1989, officially classified as stable, sealed, and safely forgotten. That story collapsed the moment the cameras came online. From a ventilation pipe on the side of the hull, a thick, cloudy plume was visibly pouring into the water. This was not sediment or rust, but a steady release of radioactive material. The submarine wasn't dormant, but leaking. When scientists sampled the water inside that plume, the results were beyond alarming. Radiation levels measured 1,000,000 times higher than normal seawater, driven largely by cesium-137. This was a radioactive isotope that does not disappear on any human timeline. This was not leftover contamination or background noise from an old wreck, but an active, concentrated leakage happening in real time.
It was a very powerful submarine to be used to attack American aircraft carriers.
The systems meant to isolate the reactor and weapons had failed silently, exactly as critics warned they eventually would. Komsomolets rests 5,500 feet below the surface, a depth once considered a natural containment strategy. It is out of sight, out of reach, and out of mind. But depth doesn't stop decay, and it doesn't stop movement. Ocean currents flow through the wreck site, carrying whatever escapes with them. The idea that the deep sea freezes danger in place was exposed as a dangerous fantasy. Isolation without monitoring doesn't create safety, but blind spots. What made the discovery truly terrifying was what the submarine still carries. Inside the corroding hull sit 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, loaded with roughly 28 pounds of weapons-grade plutonium. Plutonium doesn't neutralize itself over time. It breaks apart, corrodes, and migrates. As containment degrades, microscopic particles escape and bind to their surroundings. This isn't an explosion waiting to happen in the form of a slow, irreversible poisoning of the environment. Scientists confirmed radioactive particles attaching to seafloor sediment and to microscopic marine life around the wreck. That is the moment a localized leak becomes a biological event. Those organisms are eaten by larger ones, and contamination climbs the food chain without ever announcing itself, spreading outward year after year. For decades, the public was told that time made these wrecks safer, but the Komsomolets proved the opposite. Time didn't neutralize the threat, but activated it. What was once sealed is now failing, and what was once contained is now moving. Now, the most unsettling realization came after the data was analyzed. If a submarine lost 30 years ago is leaking now, what about the others, and just how dangerous are they? The torpedoes still armed by physics. Nuclear weapons are often imagined as dangerous only when they are armed, launched, or detonated. Once they are abandoned, sunk, or decommissioned, the assumption is that the threat ends with the mission. But that assumption is dangerously wrong. Nuclear torpedoes were never designed for permanent exposure to saltwater, pressure, and time. Their casings were built to survive combat conditions, not decades of corrosion on the seafloor. As metal weakens and seals fail, seawater penetrates spaces that were never meant to be wet. The danger is no longer a blast, but release. Inside those torpedoes, the most serious threat is plutonium. In weapons form, plutonium is tightly controlled, sealed, and isolated. In the ocean, that control erodes layer by layer. Plutonium is both chemically toxic and radiologically lethal in microscopic quantities. A particle too small to see can damage tissue, disrupt cellular processes, and remain radioactive for tens of thousands of years. As containment breaks down, plutonium doesn't sink harmlessly into the seabed. It binds easily to organic material, clinging to sediment, algae, and microscopic organisms that form the base of the marine food web. This is how abandoned nuclear weapons transform into something more insidious than a bomb. Plankton absorb contaminated particles. Small fish consume the plankton, and larger predators consume the fish. At no point does the system recognize danger. There is no biological filter that blocks plutonium. The food chain doesn't stop it, but rather concentrates it. Fish don't glow, deform instantly, or trigger alarms. Instead, they carry contamination silently, across vast distances, turning life itself into a transport mechanism. Cesium-137 makes the problem even harder to detect. Chemically, cesium behaves like potassium, which is an element essential for muscle and nerve function. As a result, living cells don't reject it, but absorb it willingly. Once cesium-137 enters the water, it spreads rapidly through the muscle tissue of marine organisms, embedding itself where it is hardest to remove. This is contamination that looks normal, moves like nutrition, and persists for decades. With a half-life of about 30 years, cesium-137 doesn't fade quickly. It accumulates, especially when the source continues to leak. The ocean is often described as vast enough to dilute anything, but now that idea collapses under scrutiny. The Arctic and North Atlantic are not sealed environments. Currents circulate continuously, ice melts seasonally, and migratory species move between ecosystems, armed, launched, or detonated. Once they are abandoned, sunk, or decommissioned, the assumption is that the threat ends with the mission. But that assumption is dangerously wrong. Nuclear torpedoes were never designed for permanent exposure to saltwater, pressure, and time. Their casings were built to survive combat conditions, not decades of corrosion on the seafloor. As metal weakens and seals fail, seawater penetrates spaces that were never meant to be wet. The danger is no longer a blast, but release. Inside those torpedoes, the most serious threat is plutonium. In weapons form, plutonium is tightly controlled, sealed, and isolated. In the ocean, that control erodes layer by layer. Plutonium is both chemically toxic and radiologically lethal in microscopic quantities. A particle too small to see can damage tissue, disrupt cellular processes, and remain radioactive for tens of thousands of years. As containment breaks down, plutonium doesn't sink harmlessly into the seabed. It binds easily to organic material, clinging to sediment, algae, and microscopic organisms that form the base of the marine food web. This is how abandoned nuclear weapons transform into something more insidious than a bomb. Plankton absorb contaminated particles. Small fish consume the plankton, and larger predators consume the fish. At no point does the system recognize danger. There is no biological filter that blocks plutonium. The food chain doesn't stop it, but rather concentrates it. Fish don't glow, deform instantly, or trigger alarms. Instead, they carry contamination silently, across vast distances, turning life itself into a transport mechanism. Cesium-137 makes the problem even harder to detect. Chemically, cesium behaves like potassium, which is an element essential for muscle and nerve function. As a result, living cells don't reject it, but absorb it willingly. Once cesium-137 enters the water, it spreads rapidly through the muscle tissue of marine organisms, embedding itself where it is hardest to remove. This is contamination that looks normal, moves like nutrition, and persists for decades. With a half-life of about 30 years, cesium-137 doesn't fade quickly. It accumulates, especially when the source continues to leak. The ocean is often described as vast enough to dilute anything, but now that idea collapses under scrutiny. The Arctic and North Atlantic are not sealed environments. Currents circulate continuously, ice melts seasonally, and migratory species move between ecosystems. A leak at depth does not stay local, but becomes mobile. Fish don't respect national borders, and radioactive particles don't recognize cleanup zones. What begins as a localized release becomes a transboundary problem without ever announcing itself. Scientists tracking isotopic signatures in marine samples are now seeing patterns that shouldn't exist if contamination were isolated. These aren't sudden spikes that suggest a single event, but trails, stretching across regions and persisting over time. Trails imply slow, continuous release rather than one-time accidents. They suggest that the torpedoes and wrecks are not static hazards, but ongoing sources. Despite this, no recovery operation has been approved to remove the nuclear torpedoes. The reason isn't a lack of concern, but risk. Disturbing the weapons could fracture already weakened containment and cause a sudden release far worse than the slow leak already underway. The torpedoes are effectively locked in a stalemate with the ocean. Leave them alone, and they continue to poison the environment gradually. Touch them, and the damage could accelerate instantly. At this point, these torpedoes are no longer weapons of war. They serve no strategic purpose and deter no enemy. They have become decaying nuclear devices governed only by physics and chemistry, not human control. Every year of corrosion strips away another layer of protection, and what makes it even more shocking was how and why these ticking bombs got down to the depths of the Arctic in the first place. The problem is that no one can say with confidence how many have already begun leaking because baseline data doesn't exist. You cannot measure deterioration accurately when you never documented the starting condition. International agencies were not informed in real time about the scale or specifics of the dumping. Even today, access to full inventories remains restricted, incomplete, or disputed. Requests for detailed records are met with partial disclosures and vague explanations. The lack of clarity is not accidental because he residue of a system built to avoid responsibility. This is more than just environmental damage as the risk is projected onto future generations, ecosystems, and neighboring states. And as scientists examine how much the damage is, one wreck stands out as the most unstable, the most reckless, and the most feared of all. It is K-27, a reactor so dangerous it was buried intact and left to age in shallow water, waiting for physics to take over. K-27, the reactor that was never supposed to be buried. The K-27 is the wreck that haunts every oceanographer and nuclear scientist who studies Cold War submarine disposal. It was an experimental vessel for liquid metal reactor technology. These are reactors that were powerful, compact, and notoriously unstable. In 1968, a reactor accident aboard K-27 irradiated the crew, leaving the vessel damaged beyond repair. Rather than attempt a risky full-scale decommissioning, Soviet authorities made a decision that would guarantee decades of ongoing risk. They scuttled the submarine intentionally, placing it in the Barents Sea as a radioactive time bomb. Unlike most sunken nuclear subs, K-27 was deposited in just 100 feet of water, a fraction of the depth considered safe for long-term containment. This was not burial, but abandonment. The reactor core was never fully defueled, leaving significant quantities of highly radioactive fuel inside the pressure hull. At that depth, natural protections offered by the ocean are minimal. Water intrusion and corrosion are accelerated, and structural failure is more likely over a shorter timescale. The submarine rests in a zone trafficked by fishing vessels, shipping lanes, and occasional naval operations, meaning human activity can disturb its fragile shell at any time. The real danger lies in the reactor itself. The liquid metal coolant, once a marvel of experimental nuclear engineering, now serves as a conduit for disaster. As the hull corrodes, water can seep directly into the reactor chamber. Under the right chemical and physical conditions, scientists warn that this could trigger a localized chain reaction. It would not be a dramatic detonation, but a silent, self-sustaining release of radiation into the surrounding water. It is, in effect, an underwater Chernobyl. But this time it is contained in a shallow sea, but capable of poisoning everything in its confined ecosystem over decades. And this is not hypothetical. Recent surveys of K-27 show accelerated corrosion along the hull, with signs of material degradation near the reactor compartment. The shallow depth increases the risk of mechanical stress. Storms, trawling equipment, or even minor seismic events can fracture the structure and accelerate exposure of radioactive fuel. Unlike deepwater wrecks that are isolated and pressurized, K-27 is exposed to the environment. The ocean is not protecting it, but actively working against it. Despite these known risks, no full recovery has taken place. Technical complexity, cost, and political hesitation have delayed action for decades. Every year that passes allows corrosion to progress, metal to weaken, and radioactive materials to shift. Time is not a stabilizer here, but an accelerant, pushing the wreck toward an inevitable point of structural failure. Each delay multiplies the potential consequences, extending the window in which a quiet environmental disaster could unfold. And as experts watch corrosion advance year by year, the question grows more urgent. When will this underwater experiment finally assert itself on the surface? And what will remain after it does? Because there is still K-159, a vessel whose abandonment would combine corrosion with human tragedy, showing how economic expedience put lives at risk. K-159 and the economics of letting men die. Back in August 2003, the decommissioned K-159 was being towed from Murmansk toward a dismantling yard in the Barents Sea. The aged, corroded, and radioactive vessel rested precariously on pontoons, barely able to keep it afloat. As a storm swept across the region, waves battered the fragile rigging, and the submarine succumbed to gravity and neglect. It sank within minutes, dragging 9 of the 10 crewmen aboard into the cold, unyielding depths. The vessel came to rest on the seabed with its nuclear reactors still inside, loaded with spent fuel and left to decay quietly in isolation. The official line called it a tragic accident caused by a convergence of weather, aging infrastructure, and human misfortune. But the reality behind the sinking is far darker. Critics have long argued that economics played a role in shaping this disaster. The cost of proper dismantling and safe disposal of a fully irradiated submarine was astronomical, far beyond what the Russian Navy or federal budget could justify at the time. Every measure required for containment, lifting, and neutralization carried a price tag in millions of dollars. Cutting corners, or simply delaying action indefinitely, became the de facto policy. In this context, some analysts have labeled the sinking an intentional accident. They see it as a failure engineered to be plausible, to remove a liability from the ledger while maintaining plausible deniability. The men who died were not targets, but they became part of a system where financial calculus outweighed human life. Even after K-159 settled on the seabed, the aftermath reflected the same pattern of deliberate neglect. Russia continued to receive international cleanup funds for nuclear waste, while the submarine remained untouched. Its reactors, containing decades of irradiated fuel, were effectively written off, their containment left to degrade under the pressure of the deep ocean. Monitoring of radiation around the wreck has been sporadic and inconsistent. Independent verification is rare, and reports are tightly controlled by government agencies. The sinking of K-159 illustrates how economic pressure can shape tolerance for extreme risk. When disposal is expensive and politically inconvenient, the policy becomes neglect, and neglect is codified in operational decisions. Men die, infrastructure fails, and radioactive material is abandoned. Yet the story is not told in headlines or official briefings. It is hidden in the paperwork of contracts, budgets, and classified operational plans. Every missing record, every vague report, reinforces the same chilling lesson. Cost determines life and death in ways that the public never sees. And Vladivostok's submarine cemetery is even more shocking. It is a shallow graveyard of decaying nuclear vessels that amplifies these risks on an industrial scale. Vladivostok's unguarded nuclear graveyard. Near Vladivostok, the ocean floor holds a ghost fleet no one wanted to claim responsibility for. Dozens of decommissioned nuclear submarines sit half-submerged in mud, their steel hulls perforated by rust, their internal compartments breached, and their reactors still intact but quietly decaying. This is not a secure military installation, but an underwater nuclear scrapyard. The vessels rest where no one monitors them rigorously, exposed to currents, storms, and mechanical disturbance. Each one a ticking system quietly corroding under pressure. The ocean floor here is not a graveyard but a countdown. After the Soviet Union collapsed, funds for dismantling these submarines vanished. Budgets disappeared, plans were shelved, and oversight evaporated. What remained was a fleet abandoned to time and corrosion, unclaimed, largely invisible, and growing more dangerous with each passing year. Reactors once brimming with fissionable material are now slowly leaking radiation into the surrounding environment. Every month, every year, this clustered failure compounds the threat, concentrating risk in one exposed area instead of dispersing it safely. Security around these wrecks is minimal at best. There are no barriers to deter unauthorized access, and experts warn that the danger isn't only in the reactors themselves. Rogue actors could scavenge specialized components not for bombs, but for knowledge in the form of reactor layouts, exposure access, and operational experience. Nuclear proliferation does not always look like stolen fuel. It can be stolen expertise, transferred through hands that never step onto a launch pad, but can replicate processes from the wreck's blueprints and hardware. Time, neglect, and secrecy have created an unintentional training ground for anyone willing to enter the area. The risk is amplified by history. Nearby lies Chajma Bay, infamous for a 1985 refueling accident. A thermal explosion killed 10 sailors and sent a radioactive plume into the sky. Decades later, parts of that contamination zone still exist, lingering in sediment and water. The proximity of these already irradiated areas to the decaying fleet creates an environment where multiple nuclear failures intersect. It is not isolated corrosion, but a clustered, compounding decay, where each vessel's failure increases the stakes of the others, multiplying potential exposure to both people and the ecosystem. Radiation monitoring is inconsistent, limited, and tightly controlled, leaving gaps in public knowledge. The true scope of contamination and risk remains unknown, leaving scientists and security experts to speculate on worst-case scenarios. Every hull exposed to saltwater pressure, every reactor left unattended. Every point of mechanical weakness represents a latent disaster, quietly evolving beneath the surface. Vladivostok's submarine graveyard is an active, concentrated site of corroding reactors, abandoned expertise, and ignored human hazard. Each vessel is a warning that decay does not neutralize danger, but it spreads it. But scientists know there is more. Project Azorian and K-129 were the secretive recovery missions that revealed how even classified interventions carried the potential to uncover and multiply nuclear threats. Project Azorian and the lies that sank with K-129. In 1968, the Soviet submarine K-129 disappeared in the Pacific Ocean with 3 nuclear missiles on board. Its loss was sudden, total, and unexplained. The official Soviet account claimed it was a tragic accident, likely caused by mechanical failure or human error. No detailed investigation was shared, and the world assumed the submarine was lost to the deep, with its secrets sealed beneath miles of cold, dark water. Yet in Washington, alarm bells rang immediately. The disappearance was not just a missing vessel, but a nuclear time bomb lying hidden, uncontrolled, potentially triggering a geopolitical disaster. The CIA responded with unprecedented urgency. They initiated Project Azorian, a top-secret operation that required building a custom ship. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was presented publicly as a deep-sea mining project. Its true mission was far more audacious: to recover K-129 from nearly 3 miles below the ocean surface, which was a depth previously thought inaccessible for such delicate work. Engineers and intelligence officers worked under extreme secrecy, aware that failure was not only operationally dangerous, but could provoke international escalation if the mission became public. Every decision was measured, and every maneuver masked by layers of deception. Publicly, the operation was described as a partial success. The narrative said the submarine broke apart during the lift, and only fragments were recovered. Thus, the story concluded neatly: a classified mission that had retrieved pieces of history, leaving the rest buried in the abyss. But whispers and conflicting accounts suggest the truth was more explosive. Some insiders claim the CIA successfully recovered most of the submarine's payload, including nuclear missiles and highly sensitive documents. Among the documents, sources allege, were plans detailing a rogue KGB operation to fabricate a nuclear strike on Hawaii, blamed on China. Had the plan succeeded or been misinterpreted, a full-scale nuclear response could have been triggered. History narrowly avoided catastrophe, and the event was buried not by accident, but by deliberate secrecy. This incident underscores the ocean floor's role as more than a repository for wrecks and waste. It is a vault of dangerous weapons where mistakes, experiments, and deliberate plans lie dormant, shielded from public scrutiny. Project Azorian was not about neutralizing hazards, but about controlling access to power and information, and retrieving what could destabilize the world if left in the wrong hands. The K-129 saga shows a broader, terrifying pattern revealed by decades of sunken nuclear history. Reactors are aging, torpedoes are decaying, and containment is failing across seas from the Arctic to the Pacific. K-278, K-27, K-159, and Vladivostok's Ghost Fleet all demonstrate the same principle. Time does not neutralize danger, but amplifies it. Secrecy, bureaucracy, and cost have allowed these hazards to remain unmonitored, misunderstood, and unresolved. Now the deep ocean is not a graveyard, but a countdown, silently ticking toward consequences engineered by human error, negligence, and intentional concealment. The submarines below are no longer historical artifacts, but are active threats, quietly aging, quietly leaking, quietly waiting. Project Azorian proves that even extraordinary efforts to intervene cannot eliminate the underlying danger. And as more wrecks corrode, more reactors fail, and more weapons leak, the oceans collectively become a slowly ticking clock reminding us that what we abandon beneath the waves does not stay buried, but accumulates, spreads, and persists. The seafloor is now the world's most patient time bomb, and humanity is still learning how close it came to disaster.